Baron von Liebig, a German chemist and inventor in the 19th century, most known for perpetuating the myth that searing meat seals in juices, which is of course false. He said nice things about chocolate, so I kind of give him a pass. But I like this quote too, because certainly in the context of the 19th century, chocolate was, remember for most of its history, chocolate has been a beverage. But certainly compared to its counterparts, tea and coffee, certainly had healthful qualities attributed to it. But I also like this because we all come to the table with certain nostalgic elements surrounding chocolate. We saw this earlier. Basically all my classes are all about this one quote, how every step of the chocolate making process is important and how every step introduces numerous areas. And again, when I was talking about kind of turning pastry chefs onto the processing steps, it's really to get them to understand the cause and effect of roasting, fermentation, genetics, and things like that. And I also love this one because it reminds us that as much as we have very serious conversations about chocolate, ultimately in the chocolate business, we're in the business of making people happy. So I remember a few years ago seeing Ed Wine speak on a panel, and the conversation was getting very heavy. And he kind of broke it and says, you know what, if you're tasting chocolate and you're not having fun, you're doing it. So one of the first tastings you have there, the little yellow cube, is a cacao juice pot de fruit. And again, as much as I would love to take people to Origin on a regular basis, I don't have that capability. But when people come into the lab, I try to give them the fullest experience possible. And this is actually a relatively new, interesting product that's being produced out of Ecuador and finished in New Jersey, I believe. It's a pressed cacao juice from the pulp. So what you have there is a pot de fruit, a little French-style fruit jelly, the pressed cacao juice. From what I understand, the byproduct of the pressing is very, very rich in pectin. So they're actually trying to figure out how to extract that pectin. So assuming that most of the pectin is in the byproduct of the pressing, there is a little bit of pear puree in this too to give the jelly a little bit of natural pectin to enhance its texture. But again, in a room like this, most of us have experienced the fresh pulp of a cocoa pot. But many of the people coming into our chocolate lab in New York City have no idea. Something else that I'm sure a lot of people in this room can recognize. Does anyone not know what this is? This is actually, I just received this sample 48 hours ago, and a little less than a pound, so I sacrificed about half of that sample to bring to you in case you've never seen it before. This is a close cousin of Theobroma cacao, Theobroma bicolor. And I find this really interesting because, from my research, this was just as widely used as cacao was in Mesoamerican cultures, but over the years it fell out of favor. Certainly not widely planted as Theobroma cacao is. This is just lightly roasted. It's got a little funky, nutty character to it. Again, I've not worked with these at all, so I'm really excited to play with these, maybe even more from a culinary standpoint than a confectionery standpoint. So when I started putting together the chocolate lab in Lower Manhattan, I started thinking of the fact that I was perhaps bringing chocolate back to Lower Manhattan, the oldest part of the city. And when I left the restaurant world, the 70-hour-a-week grind of being a restaurant pastry chef, the one hobby I did take up for myself was researching my own family history, genealogy. So I really love history, and certainly with aspects of cooking, I think as much as I'm all about evolution and innovation, I also think we can learn a lot from history. So when I started thinking about the fact that we were manufacturing chocolate in Lower Manhattan, again, I started thinking, well, when was the last time, or when was the first time chocolate was manufactured in New York City? And at first I thought maybe New Amsterdam, because in following my family history, I can actually trace a cousin of one of my direct ancestors to owning a brewery at Beaver and Broad Street in the financial district today of Manhattan. So I figured if I can find Johannes Vermeulen in 1650s New Amsterdam, I can find chocolate. Turned out that was a little too early by a few decades. And when you Googled New York City chocolate history, nothing came up. So I used some of that genealogical research skill that I had developed, and all of a sudden I just ended up with a mountain of really cool information that no one's ever really kind of collected before. And I realized that there was a golden age, or what I kind of consider a golden age of chocolate manufacturing in Manhattan in the latter half of the 19th century, as well as Philadelphia and up here in Massachusetts. So I kind of went off the deep end, and I've also spent a lot of money on eBay on Victorian-era trade cards and cocoa tins and whatnot. But Maillard was a nationally known brand, a French immigrant in the 1840s, no relation to the Maillard reaction. So I started thinking about, well, what contributed to this golden age of chocolate manufacturing 150 years ago? Certainly evolved tools and technology. I mean, I think chocolate is very much a product of the Industrial Revolution, and thus I think it should continue to evolve. In addition to those three things I mentioned, I learned about chocolate: the janitorial, the making chocolate is easy, making good chocolate is hard, and the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know. I also realize the more I work with chocolate, the more conservative I get with chocolate. I'm just trying to figure out what those beans want to be. But I also know that chocolate is a product of evolved tools and technology. And then we had that really important shift from chocolate only being a beverage to being used in confections. And you can kind of mark that in the middle of the 19th century. If you look at early 19th century cookbooks, you might have a recipe for a chocolate beverage, but it wouldn't have been used in confections or cakes or desserts at all. If you take it as gospel that it was Fry who was the first to add cocoa butter to ground cocoa beans and some sugar, that was really the birth of the modern chocolate bar in the late 1840s. And we also have just the growth of the city itself and the fact that New York has always been cosmopolitan. And cocoa beans, as they were coming up from the Caribbean on their way to Europe, would come through the port. As more and more cocoa beans would come through the port, more and more stayed. So by the mid-19th century, there were dozens of small-scale chocolate makers in Manhattan. And with that, the first waves of immigration with confectioners and chocolate makers who are already skilled in the craft from Europe, as well as the accessibility and affordability of the ingredients, which became more accessible to the average citizen. And then you also saw these chocolate companies grow in scale to the point where they were servicing areas beyond their immediate vicinity or region. I haven't read the whole book, but I love this passage. It was a book it's supposed to be a contemporaneous diary of a young girl living in what today would be the East Village in Manhattan. I think it was written when she was an adult, because Felix Effray was a real chocolate maker in the 1800s, but at this date he was not at this address. But one thing that I found interesting in all this research is the cyclical nature of things. How sort of the craft artisanal chocolate philosophy kind of mirrors some of the things that we saw back then. Chocolate was a part of the daily life. It was part of the street life. You could walk down the street and see these big melangeurs turning in the front window. And now it's kind of a novelty to walk into a storefront factory and see chocolate being made. There's a lot of great historical, I guess you could call them chocolate textbooks. This one was from 1902, the Zipperer book, kind of showing the growth, the industrialization of chocolate as we got into the 20th century. So often the cocoa beans would have been taken to the uppermost floor of the factory, and through each step of the process went down the floor until it was finally packaged and shipped out of the ground floor. So, it looks like all the samples have been distributed. Although every once in a while, like a 100-year-old sample of chocolate will come up. I'm curious. I don't know. I want to spend $300 on a ballooned piece of chocolate that's 100 years old, but they're out there. So what was my strategy here? I didn't want to seem condescending, like I'm going to make flawed chocolate, like they didn't know how to make good chocolate, but I certainly wanted to make chocolate without necessarily using all the tools that I have at my disposal. So this was made in a stone grinder, melangeur type stone grinder. This is even as late as the 1920s. A couple different recipes, like industrial manufacturing type recipes that I discovered. Obviously there was added cocoa butter. I would have thought that maybe in the 19th century single origin might have been default. You were getting the beans that you were getting. But obviously this modern chocolate on the right with the added cocoa butter. But yeah, chocolate culture was continuing to come into its own by the 1890s. So you had these technological advances. You had eating chocolate, not just chocolate for beverages. You also had chocolate being used in confectionery and baking items. You also had a surge in recipe publishing. All the major newspapers were publishing recipes, and you had sort of the proto-celebrity chefs. One of the first was Miss Parloa from up here in Boston, who was writing the old Walter Baker recipe books from the Victorian era. You also had health claims with chocolate, but then also this was before the Pure Food and Drug Acts. The one thing that struck me is how often we see in the Victorian era, so 130, 140 years ago, the use of the actual cocoa pod imagery in advertising. I'm middle-aged, grew up in suburban Midwest. I didn't know what a cocoa pod was until well into my career as a pastry chef. But here it was used all the time in these trade cards, on cocoa tins. What I also think is interesting is in the 1880s we see from bean to cup. So bean to bar is not a new concept or recipe. There's another one from bean to cup. Hyder's was another national known brand that existed into the 20th century. Their factory was located just off Union Square in Manhattan. And then the last sample, as I mentioned, I kind of find myself getting more conservative, I guess as a chocolate maker. But with all the classes that I do, especially the longer form classes, I always like to throw in something interesting, something fun. So we're pretty much focusing on single origin, trying to understand the differences between beans, also taking the same bean and altering the process, different roast profiles, etc., different formulations. But the last sample, when you have a little tiny tablet, is something that's become kind of a regular in the classes that I do. And this one is about a week old from the last class I did. It's a dark milk style, so it's a 54%. This is a blend of the Oco Caribe and Camino Verde from Ecuador. Half of the sugar is maple sugar. And in place of commercial whole milk powder, which, at least in a quantity that I have easy access to, I'm not really thrilled with the flavor of most commercial milk powders I try. It hit me that I could go back to a technique that I've been working with now for 15 years or so. It's essentially making a browned milk solids or brown butter powder by reducing heavy cream to the point where it basically breaks and turns into clarified butter and brown milk solids. So we get sort of a brown butter flavor. So this is a maple brown butter dark milk chocolate. But you know, it's something I think about, because no worries. But yeah, I think about where we can be headed, and certainly I think what's really interesting is seeing the number of pastry chefs turn chocolate makers, and seeing where their sensibilities will take it. I don't know that I agree 100%, but there are some people out there in the chocolate world that say, okay, we've had enough 70% single origin bars, like enough already. So what is the next thing? And I start thinking a lot about the wine analogy. I was thinking about it this morning. Most commercial chocolate is what? It's made to be consistent. The same batch to batch, year in, year out. Craft, artisan, did we decide on the name? Specialty chocolate. It embraces that variability from batch to batch. Much like a winemaker might have a house style, but their wine is going to change from vintage to vintage because it's an agricultural product. But I like thinking about that even further. Thinking about that appellation contrôlée. Chateau de Pop is an amazing wine, but it can have 13 different grapes in it. So maybe blending is the next step, and it's certainly far more difficult to blend with intention than simply just making single origin, and it is what it is. Or even the super Tuscans, which completely abandon all the rules of, at least the legal rules of winemaking in Italy, and they're some of the best wines in the world. So some of the kind of things I'm thinking of. To kind of go back, one thing I didn't mention about the bicolor, the macambo, what did you call it?
Petaxte.
Yeah, it has a lot of different names. Like I said, I literally got those 2 days ago. And the cool thing about being a bar chocolate lab is your office is people just bring you stuff. So right now, whenever I'm traveling next week, or when I do get back into the lab, I've got my first beans from Thailand, actually, that I've had yet to work with. But a sample of beans from Thailand. I have a sample of beans from some indigenous farmers in the lowlands of Colombia. I have a lot of cool things that I have kind of on my plate. Sometimes there are people send you stuff that's not that great. So an example of that, and I'll finish with this. Someone brought me some beans from St. Lucia, which not a lot of beans leave St. Lucia because they have such a vibrant cocoa tourism there. So she brought them and she's like, well, just so you know, they're unfermented. I'm like, oh, okay, there's not much I can do with them. So, and they might not have been dried very well. So I have a moisture analyzer. I took the moisture analysis, and they were like almost 10% moisture. So if you know anything about dried cocoa beans, that's too rough. But as a teaching tool, now I can show students, after I've dried them out a little bit, what a 100% slate bean cut test looks like. So always important that we learn from our mistakes, and we can learn a lot from the flaws. I think we're about that for the next tasting, so I will leave it at that.
We do have a couple of minutes for some questions. Anybody has some questions? Could I pass the microphone around? Questions? I think we have no questions. Oh, yes, oh, I'm sorry, madam. Yeah, we do have a question.
Maybe everyone knows the answer to this, but historically, what were molds made out of? Like, you were talking about the history and tempering, and I thought, if it wasn't well tempered, how were they?
Sure, well, I mean, the fact that really up until the mid-20th century, metal molds were still very common. So that metal pulls heat away from things. So that might have actually helped compensate for not perfect tempering. Yeah, I should have mentioned that, but that's true.
And going back to historical trends, as you received the B2 cup, do you think eventually we'll go back to eating higher sugar content chocolate, as we're moving away right now?
I don't know about that. I mean, I think I always felt that, you know, as palates got more sophisticated and darker was better. I mean, milk chocolate can be pretty good when it's good. So that's actually my favorite category is the dark milk, because it does give you the best of both. It gives you flavor, but it kind of gives you some of that nostalgic.
A lot of different views around the world.
But it's a learning experience. Maple sugar and not maple syrup in the chocolate. But for me, it's flavor first and foremost, and then functionality.
Going back about sugar and historical chocolate, what are your thoughts on the type of sugar they were using in the refinement compared to today's sugar?
That's something I've thought of a bit, but haven't done a lot of research. I know kind of what grew up alongside the chocolate industry in Lower Manhattan was the sugar industry. So we can actually trace, I think it's Theodore Roosevelt's third great grandfather was a chocolate maker. Actually, he owned a mill and he ground chocolate and he ground linseed oil and pigments for paint. But his nephew was one of the first sugar refiners in Manhattan. So those industries kind of grew up, but I haven't done enough research myself to understand the level of refinement of those sugars, their flavors, their